Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next web presentation on New Thinking on Investment Treaties, brought to you by the CCSI and the Global Economic Governance Program at Oxford University. My name is Mona Pinchis, and I'm currently a doctoral researcher at King's College London. So this presentation captures one component of my doctoral research on the history of the Fair and Equitable Treatment and Investment Treaty Standard. A variation of this material can also be found in a chapter in a forthcoming book on investment law and history, edited by Stefan Schill, Rainer Hoffman, and Christian Tams. Let me begin by providing some information about the standard. So the treaty standard has really risen to prominence in the past few decades. Investors have alleged breach of fair and equitable treatment in almost every claim brought under an investment treaty. And not only are they raising such claims, but they're successful. And due to the vague nature of the terms fair and equitable, a government can be in breach of fair and equitable treatment even if the foreign investment is treated as well or even better than a local investment. However, this same vagueness makes it very difficult to assess what sort of government conduct can be challenged for failure to meet this standard. Despite the proliferation of investment treaties since 2000 and many arbitral awards, it appears that there's still debate among scholars and lawmakers as to its scope and meaning. So this presentation focuses on how the United States planned, debated, and drafted the Fair and Equitable Treatment Clause over a 10-year period from 1945 to 1955. And though my focus in my doctoral research was on multilateral negotiations for international economic agreements, I included research on the American practice because, based on my research, the Americans were the first to push for the inclusion of the concept in the context of foreign investment promotion. So the post-war years mentioned were a critical time for the Americans. Emerging as a strong economic power, the U.S. was influential in developing new international economic institutions grounded in their goals for world trade and development. In reviewing American materials, I investigated why the U.S. government and governments negotiating with them began including fair and equitable treatment, or just equitable treatment, concepts in investment-focused treaties. To this end, I examined over 5,000 primary documents from the U.S. National Archives, and I'm happy to discuss some of the details of my historical methodology as well as its challenges in questions. So I'm going to present my findings in three parts for you. Part one is going to focus on how fair and equitable, or equitable treatment, formed a part of the Americans' underlying goals for investment-focused treaty development. Part two is going to explain how the concept became a part of the American commercial treaties and how it took an interpretive role as guidance for future treaty commitments. Part three is going to explain how fair and equitable, or equitable treatment, served an additive function as a restatement of the treaty's objects and purpose to protect foreign investment on an interstate level and as a treaty device to trigger interstate consultations. Let's start with part one. So in looking at how the concept of equitable treatment fit into Americans' post-war economic goals, I researched how the Americans mentioned the concept of equitable treatment in foreign and domestic policy. How did it relate to their motivations for designing commercial treaties that promoted and protected private investment abroad after the Second World War? So following the war, the U.S. government believed that restoring the global economy was the key to sustainable domestic growth. In the face of economic nationalism, the increase of nationalizations, and unstable exchange relations between national currencies, the Americans participated in bilateral and multilateral plans for international economic development. A critical part of the U.S. government's goals was the improvement in growth of underdeveloped areas, as discussed during the Bretton Woods Conference and by President Truman in his post-war plans. Soon, private investment abroad became the crux of the American Plan for International Development. This was for several reasons. First, there were sincere efforts to assist development in countries that were broken from decades of war and threatened under new political, particularly Soviet, pressure. Second, private investment abroad was a means for the U.S. to spread its political clout without draining government resources. Third, it was promoted as a way to further expand domestic growth. And fourth, the Americans sought a united democratic world against the rise of communist threats. Now, not all countries shared the Americans' plans for international development, and there were concerns that development driven by private capital would be problematic, as the goal of commercially profitable investment didn't always align with the objectives of development and economic independence. Several countries sought strategies to insulate their economies and peoples from outside economic development. And the American business community became concerned with these issues, and one response was a strategy to provide assurances to U.S. investors abroad with the retooling of U.S. commercial treaties with investment protection. How did equitable treatment become part of the provisions for investment promotion? Well, the Americans had used the concept of equitable treatment in trade agreements before. In the Interwar League of Nations talks, the participating states had agreed on the concept of equitable treatment as part of an overarching commitment between states, and then as treaty language used to trigger consultations whereby states could address harmful government conduct. The concept of fair and equitable treatment had also been standard American trade treaty practice that was used in situations where a more precise rule couldn't be agreed upon. That being said, the concept was actually not initially included in provisions for investment protection and promotion. Therefore, the first post-war commercial treaty efforts with the Republic of China and with the Italian Republic did not contain references to equitable treatment or fair and equitable treatment. Now, in designing foreign investment policy, the U.S. had intergovernmental agencies, the National Advisory Council, and the Executive Committee on Economic Foreign Policy, providing that equitable treatment was one of the main principles for promoting investment. Instead of just simply including a requirement of non-discrimination, these agencies explained that treaties should include the concept as a general statement that United States investors would be accorded non-discriminatory, reasonable, fair, and equitable treatment. It was intended to frame the other treaty obligations, such as the unreasonable or discriminatory clause and the standards of national treatment and most favored nation treatment. Now, to me, this signals that investors were to have an expectation that their investments abroad would be accorded equitable treatment generally. Let me turn to part 2. Here I want to explain how the U.S. government transitioned from citing equitable treatment as a concept necessary for the promotion of international development to using equitable treatment as a general principle to address unforeseen government conduct. So in 1950, the U.S. model draft included the equitable treatment concept, and the treaties with Uruguay and Ireland were the first bilateral commercial treaties to include the concept, as did multilateral efforts such as the 1948 Economic Agreement of Bogota. So as you can see here, equitable treatment was the first line alongside an agreement not to take unjustified, unreasonable, or discriminatory measures, and this was often found in the middle of the treaty following the standards of national treatment and most favored nation treatment and the protection of persons abroad. Through several negotiations in the early 1950s, the concept of equitable treatment had an interpretive function. It served as a guiding principle that promoted an equitable construction of the treaty, and this was particularly relevant in situations where the exact terms of the treaty did not afford complete and definitive guidance. The very inclusion of equitable treatment in the treaty introduced the State Department's strategy to include a broad and vague provision that spoke to effects rather than when capturing specific causes. Moreover, not only did it offer ex-ante assurances, the U.S. government began to view the concept as a way to analyze ex-post measures that may harm the other contracting state party. In contract theory, you could see the clause as aiding the completion of the incomplete contract of U.S. commercial treaties by perhaps offering extra guidance as to how to interpret unreasonable or discriminatory measures. Now, later, the U.S. Standard Model Draft shifts equitable treatment and moves it to Article 1 of its Standard Model Draft. As Article 1, this principle would begin to aid a much wider field of controversies. With the isolation of the clause, it emerges as a guiding principle, providing for equitable considerations for all commitments under the treaty. Further, the State Department adds a purpose. The clause would serve as a treaty device to enable an opportunity to contest government conduct without mention of compensation in extreme or unusual circumstances, very similar to early League of Nations discussions. So turning to part 3, in 1950, as I mentioned, the U.S. State Department had relocated the equitable treatment concept. Here's the language at the top here. Now, due to challenges raised by Japan and Germany, the State Department, for the first time, presented instruction as to the meaning and object of the equitable treatment concept. The clause continues to serve as a guiding principle, but in this third part, I want to show how the State Department reacted to challenges of the clause by providing more exacting purposes. In an effort to demonstrate my findings, I'm going to offer examples of the evidence collected in the negotiations with the Japanese and the Federal Republic of Germany. Let's begin with Japan. During preliminary discussions, the Japanese took issue with Article 1 and wanted to further define equitable treatment with the standards of most favored nation treatment and national treatment, similar to the tactics of the intergovernmental agencies. But this plan was rejected by the State Department, and when the official meetings began in 1951, the Japanese just sought deletion of Article 1 for the following reasons. The Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs found that the term equitable very difficult to translate into Japanese. The ministry also stated that the body of the treaty should only prescribe definite rights and obligations, and it was inappropriate to put in a provision which introduced a new concept of general equitable treatment, the concrete application of which had not been established in international law alongside the internationally accepted concepts of national treatment and most favored nation treatment. They also said that equitable treatment added ambiguity to the treaty and would be a cause for controversy in the future. Now, a few days later, the State Department issued an instruction as to the meaning and function of Article 1. They said that this is a link between a preamble and the rest of the treaty. It introduced the treaty by declaring the equitable purposes the treaty is designed to serve and the equitable principles the two signatories undertake to apply, as are spelled out by the more specific terms of the provisions commencing with Article 2. They also said that it served a twofold further purpose. It promoted an equitable construction of the treaty, which was in conformity with the American court's approach that treaties should be construed in a broad and liberal manner. And it served as a guiding principle in cases where the exact terms of the treaty's provisions do not afford complete and definitive guidance. And you see the same purpose being elaborated in discussions for the Uruguay Treaty years earlier. So the State Department also explained that the term equitable was not really a precise term. Article 1 could then afford a basis for a treaty protest in extreme or unusual cases, since the more exact legal rules define the normal commitments that the two countries would have undertaken. They did note, however, that equitable was not altogether novel in current international usage. They stated, for example, that it had been cited in the ITO Charter and other international instruments and literature dealing with international law and justice. It had also been standard practice, as you may recall I mentioned earlier, for it to be used in U.S. trade treaty practice where a more precise rule could have been devised. So therefore you see fair and equitable treatment being used, for example, for state trading. Subsequent discussions centered on the Japanese difficulty with the meaning of equitable treatment, particularly for assessing future situations. One solution proposed by the Japanese was that the clause should be incorporated within the preamble, but this idea was rejected. In another meeting, the Japanese negotiator questioned whether equitable treatment was a standard of treatment akin to national treatment and most favored nation treatment, and continued to demand for its deletion. The U.S. negotiators confirmed that equitable treatment did not establish a third standard of treatment. The American representatives urged the Japanese to understand the clause as a guiding principle of justice, under which the specific standards of national and most favored nation treatment were applied. Following several discussions, the State Department concluded that equitable treatment was simply not important enough to fight over. They granted permission to the representatives to delete Article 1 if it was next proposed by the Japanese. There was a brief exchange whereby equitable treatment was considered to be placed within the dispute settlement provision, but ultimately the parties agreed to delete Article 1 in its entirety, though the unreasonable or discriminatory clause remains as Article 4 in the treaty. Let's turn to Germany. Negotiations formally began in the fall of 1953, months after the signing of the Japanese treaty. These negotiations also began with the U.S. Standard Model Draft. Now, whereas the Japanese had found the clause unsuitable and sought its deletion, the Germans argued that Article 1 was unnecessarily brief and in fact naked, and they sought to amplify the provision by including new references for friendship and navigation, noting that the present clause dealt solely with commerce. During these negotiations, the Germans proposed new language. They wanted to add the terms fair and to the equitable treatment clause. The reason was because recht und billig were naturally put together, and thus it was an important amendment in the interest of obtaining a smooth German translation. As to the purpose of the clause, the State Department reiterated the instructions it had provided for the Japanese. The State Department instruction confirmed the major justification for the article was that it afforded a guiding principle for situations where no specific rule of the treaty was applicable. And to clarify, they provided an example. A given governmental measure may technically comply with the legal rule of national treatment, yet be so arbitrary and so burdensome in its impact on the foreigner as to be grossly unjust. Here's an example of the final clause as found in the treaty. As to the decision to include a reference of fair and, the State Department did not find the change controversial and accepted it without controversy or discussion. Again, recall that fair and equitable treatment had been used in other trade treaties and had begun to have been used in other treaties, for example, with respect to developing countries. So it wasn't that new for them. So throughout the reviewed, there wasn't a single trajectory as to the role and function of equitable treatment within the Americans' first investment-focused treaties. Interestingly, despite the challenges from Japan and Germany, the clause was often an unimportant element to signing a commercial treaty. Several countries that negotiated with the Americans ignored it, focusing instead on more important issues such as exchange control regulation and the movement of persons. If a country distrusted the clause, the State Department was quick to delete it. This history shows that underneath the tip of the iceberg lies a large body of development which seems counter to our contemporary understanding of the Fair and Equitable Treatment Clause, particularly as a substantive treaty standard. The concept of equitable treatment was not a standard akin to national treatment or most favored nation treatment. Instead, it took on a more interesting purpose, an opportunity to address harm not only resulting from a treaty breach, but even impairment of the object of the treaty itself. If any measure adopted by a state party had the effect of impairing investments abroad or the objects of the treaty, but didn't necessarily breach one of the other commitments, the U.S. had the authority to assess the measure, whether or not it conflicted with those terms of the treaty, and call for consultations or complain about the measure. That notwithstanding, in my review of the Americans' inclusion of the clause in their commercial treaties, I never came across a discussion that connected a violation of the clause and a trigger of compensation. Indeed, the State Department confirms that the U.S. government does not pay compensation for all losses which government action may cause. In line with not seeing it as a standard of treatment, there's never a discussion that pairs fair and equitable treatment or equitable treatment with a minimum standard of treatment for aliens or the Mixed Claims Commission's approach in the LFA Chenier and Pauline Neer case. This suggests that the concept of equitable treatment was demarcated from academic and state practice with respect to the important discussions as to protection of persons at the time. But note that the absence of such discussions may simply have been a strategic decision by the State Department. Overall, equitable treatment can really be seen as imparting flexibility into the treaty, allowing for the ex post analysis of whether the state's measures were fair or reasonable. Such flexibility accords with the Americans' interest in maintaining a treaty that avoids overly strict formulation. These treaties were repeatedly viewed as essentially constitution-like in nature, and the State Department explained that a U.S. commercial treaty aims at establishing the rule of law in their everyday relations with the country concerned. I should also emphasize that the clause was never associated with the contemporary investment law system as we know it today. Therefore, the negotiating representatives and the U.S. government never contemplated how private investors would apply the Fair and Equitable Treatment Clause to harmful effects upon their private investments. But understanding how fair and equitable treatment changes once combined with investor-state dispute settlement is a story for another time. Thank you for listening.